They told her to wait outside. A captain, a leader, a woman who had spent years proving herself in the skies, denied entry at her own airline's office, while her white colleagues walked right in. That was the moment she realized silence was no longer an option. She had the proof, she had the names, and this time, the world was going to listen. They never expected her to be the one in charge. That mistake would be their downfall. The moment she stepped through the towering glass doors, a blast of cool, sterile air greeted her, masking the tension that clung to the space like an unshaken secret. The lobby was a monument to wealth's sleek marble floors, angular modern furniture, everything so perfectly placed it felt designed to be admired, rather than used. Captain Elise Carter adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag, its edges softened by years of use, and made her way toward the reception desk. Her footsteps barely made a sound, but she could feel every pair of eyes tracking her presence. She wasn't here to fly today. No cockpit, no pre-flight checks. This was something far more important. A meeting with the board, a discussion long overdue, but as she approached the desk, the woman behind it barely spared her a glance, her manicured nails clicking away at a keyboard with disinterest. Elise slid her ID onto the counter. "I'm here for employees need to wait outside." The receptionist cut in, her tone mechanical, rehearsed. Elise's brow furrowed. "I'm not just an employee. I'm Captain Elise Carter. I have a meeting." Pilots use the restricted entrance. The woman interrupted again, still refusing to look up. Elise let out a slow, measured breath. She had dealt with turbulence before, but this was something else. "I know where the pilot's entrance is. I'm not here as a pilot today. I'm here as a guest for a meeting with the board," she said, tapping her ID. "Check the list." "Carter." The receptionist's eyes flicked up, skimming over her with barely concealed skepticism. For a moment there was silence, a pause heavy with something unspoken. Then, lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, the woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, if you're not authorized, I can't let you in." Before Elise could answer, movement behind her caught her attention. Two men strolled in, both dressed casually, both carrying the same air of confidence that came with knowing you belonged. "Morning," one of them said with an easy grin. The receptionist's demeanor changed instantly. "Captain Reynolds, Captain Hayes, go right in. No ID check, no hesitation, just a warm smile, and an open door." Elise turned slowly, watching them disappear down the pristine hallway before facing the receptionist again. Her voice was steady, but steel laced her words. "You let them in without checking anything. Why am I being told to wait outside?" The receptionist didn't falter, her smile now something sharper, colder. "They've been here before. I recognize them." Elise exhaled sharply. She had been here before too, more times than she could count, but it seemed to some she would always be a stranger. "I've worked here for 12 years. Captain Elise Carter's voice was calm, steady, but the weight behind it was undeniable. The receptionist hesitated, fingers frozen over the keyboard, but before she could form a response, movement from the corner of Elise's eye made her tense. A uniformed security guard approached, broad-shouldered, unreadable, the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter, that sent a message before a single word was spoken. "Is there a problem?" His voice was deep, authoritative, but his eyes were locked only on Elise. The shift in the room was palpable. Conversations quieted, glances flickered toward them, and yet no one truly looked, just the kind of subtle, practiced avoidance that let people convince themselves they weren't complicit. The air was thick with something unspoken, something Elise had felt too many times before. "No problem at all," she said, gripping the strap of her bag, just a little tighter. "I'm just trying to get to my meeting." The guard barely reacted. "Ma'am, if you don't have the proper clearance, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." The words were polite, but the message was anything but. Elise felt it in her bones, that quiet expectation. Walk away, don't make trouble, let it go. She had done it before, more times than she could count, but not today. "Check the list," she said, her voice measured, controlled. For a moment the receptionist just stared. as if daring her to back down. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she tapped at the keyboard. The seconds stretched, tension hanging heavy between them. Elise saw it before the woman even spoke. The slight widening of her eyes, the flicker of realization, the moment she understood she had made a mistake. A cleared throat, a forced indifference. "Oh, I see you here." Elise didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched as the woman shifted uncomfortably. "You can go in." No apology, no acknowledgement, just quiet confirmation of what Elise already knew, that she had been right all along. She held the receptionist's gaze for a beat longer, then slowly picked up her ID from the counter, turning toward the doors without another word. But something inside her had shifted. For years she had collected moments like this, tucking them away with the rest, convincing herself they weren't worth the fight. The quiet doubts, the questioning of her legitimacy, the small careful ways people made it clear she didn't belong. But this time she wasn't just walking away. This time, she had proof, and proof was powerful. This time she wasn't letting it slide. Captain Elise Carter sat in the meeting room, her fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface of the conference table, the rhythmic sound barely audible beneath the droning voices of the airline executives. They spoke in carefully rehearsed tones about their commitment to diversity, about progress and change. But she wasn't really listening, not because she didn't care. No, she cared too much, but because their words were just that, words, and her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment at the front desk, the way the receptionist's expression had shifted from indifference to realization, the way security had loomed over her like a silent warning, the way every subtle gesture had sent a clear message. "You don't belong here." She inhaled slowly, glancing toward the large window on the other side of the room. The city skyline stretched before her, glass towers reflecting the golden hues of a setting sun, but her gaze drifted lower, catching her own reflection. Her crisp navy blazer, the gold wings pinned to her chest, the uniform she had earned through years of perseverance, yet the same uniform that had so often been a magnet for doubt, scrutiny, and assumptions. Elise had been flying for over a decade, longer if you counted the years spent fighting for her place in the industry. For every inch of space she occupied, she thought back to flight school, her first day full of nerves and quiet determination. "Are you sure you're in the right class?" The instructor had asked it with a smirk, and the room had erupted in laughter. She hadn't laughed, and she hadn't forgotten. Then there was her first time stepping into a cockpit, as a co-pilot. The captain, an older man with salt and pepper hair, had done a double take. "Did you just graduate? You look a little green." She had already been flying for 4 years by then, and it didn't stop after she became a captain. If anything, it got worse. The passengers who would hesitate before following her announcements, the ones who asked for the real captain, the flight attendants who mistook her for a junior crew member, the gate agents who had once asked her if she was lost while she was walking to her own aircraft. She had let it go, again and again, kept her head down, worked twice as hard, let the comments, the assumptions, the dismissals slide off her back like water. But she never forgot. She had been keeping track. The folder on her laptop wasn't just a collection of incidents, it was proof. Years of notes, emails, complaints filed and ignored, conversations recorded, not because she wanted to, but because she had learned she might need to. The time she was passed over for a promotion, only to watch it handed to someone with less experience, less flight hours, but the right look. The time a colleague had casually joked, "They're only keeping you around so they can say they have one of you." The time a passenger refused to believe she was the captain, even after she introduced herself, choosing instead to ask the male co-pilot if he was really the one in charge. Her grip on the table tightened. This time she wasn't just going to let it be another story she told herself in the quiet of her hotel room, another frustration buried beneath layers of resilience. No, this time, she was going to make sure they remembered. Because this time she had everything she needed. And proof was power. They could put her on the website, use her image for their diversity campaigns, parade her around as a symbol of progress. But when it came to respect, to real change, she was still just another name they could dismiss. Captain Elise Carter had smiled through it all. The casual remarks at corporate dinners, the time an executive half drunk on expensive whiskey had called her a diversity hire to her face. The forced small talk with senior pilots, who barely concealed their surprise that she had made it this far. The headlines the company loved to push, breaking barriers, women in aviation, a new era of leadership, while behind the scenes, nothing really changed. She had endured. She had kept her head down, ignored the stares, let the comments roll off her like turbulence on a long-haul flight. She had memorized every rule in the handbook, perfected every maneuver, studied until she could fly in her sleep, because she had to be better, always. But now she wasn't just remembering every slight, every moment of doubt thrown her way. Now she was about to do something about it, because today wasn't just another bad day, it was the last straw. Elise kept her expression neutral as the meeting dragged on. The executives spoke in their polished corporate language, words rehearsed to sound meaningful, but ultimately empty, building a culture of inclusivity, expanding opportunities, fostering diversity. She had heard it all before. It was the same speech, just with different buzzwords. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She didn't need to check it to know what it was. The news had already spread. Just heard what happened at the front desk. Unreal. You okay? She inhaled slowly, her fingers hovering over the screen before she typed back. I'm done letting this slide. Because that's what it had always been. Letting things slide. Letting people assume. Letting them question. Letting them doubt her, while she kept proving herself over and over again. She had thought that proving herself would be enough. That being exceptional would silence the doubts. But it never was. Not when security had approached her today, already assuming she was the problem. Not when the receptionist had dismissed her, while her colleagues had walked past without question. Not when after 11 years in this industry, she was still fighting to be seen. She opened her email. The draft had been sitting there for months, waiting for her to be ready. A formal complaint outlining systemic discrimination within the airline. Names, dates, incidents. She had spent months gathering them, cross-referencing flight logs, collecting statements from other pilots who had quietly confided in her about their own experiences. She had hesitated before, worried about consequences, wondered if she was overreacting, but not anymore. Her hand was steady as she moved the cursor to the send button. A deep breath, a moment of silence, and then she pressed it. Later that night, she sat in her apartment, scrolling through the responses. Some were immediate automated acknowledgments. Others were more direct, yet just as dismissive. We take all allegations seriously, but we regret that you feel this way. If you'd like to discuss this privately, we encourage a conversation with HR. She clenched her jaw, staring at the screen. They weren't taking her seriously. They thought this would disappear, like all the other complaints before hers, that she would get tired, that she would walk away, like so many others had. She exhaled slow and deliberate, and reached for her phone. One call, that was all it would take. She had contacts, reporters, lawyers, people who had been waiting for someone like her to finally say, enough. She tapped the number, brought the phone to her ear. A voice answered on the other end. It's time, she said. We're taking this public, because if they weren't going to listen, she was going to make them. They wouldn't listen behind closed doors. Fine, she would make sure the world heard her, instead. And once the world was watching, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. Elise Carter barely slept that night. Her phone buzzed constantly, texts, emails, missed calls. By the time she opened her eyes the next morning, the storm had already hit. Her story was everywhere. A journalist from a major aviation outlet had picked it up first. The headline stark and unflinching: Black female captain denied entry at her own airline's headquarters, forced to wait while white colleagues walked in. Her stomach twisted as she read the words. Seeing it laid out like that, blunt and undeniable, sent a shiver down her spine. Then came the flood. Messages. So many messages. Other pilots, some still employed, Some long gone reached out. This happened to me too. I was pushed out after I complained. I have proof. Where can I send it? And then something Elise hadn't expected. Passengers. I remember feeling relieved when I saw a white pilot taking over from a black one. I hate that I thought that way. I watched a flight attendant question a black pilot once while letting her white co-pilot through, without a word. It made me sick. Elise sat back, phone in hand, pulse pounding. She had known, of course. She had known. She had lived it. But this was bigger. The whispers were turning into a roar. Former employees, customers, insiders, everyone was speaking up. The airline had spent years carefully crafting an image of diversity and progress. Now that image was shattering. By midday, the airline released its first public statement. We are conducting an internal review regarding recent allegations. We remain committed to diversity, inclusion, and fairness.